All very welcome. Thanks for coming here. We're gifted with this beautiful day. It's a great honor to welcome Professor Diane Hall to give the Irish Studies International Lecture for 2023. This is our flagship annual lecture, so we're absolutely delighted that Professor Hall is going to be our speaker today. The title of her talk is Coming Home, Australians in Ireland, 1850 to 1925. 400,000 Irish settled in Australia between 1788 and the 1920s. And a considerable part of Diane Hall's career has been concerned with this movement. At Victoria University in Melbourne, and before that here in Queen's and in the University of Melbourne, she's worked in a variety of areas around Australia, but on earlier Ireland again, as we shall see. Her best known publications are probably A New History of the Irish in Australia, published in 2018 with Elizabeth Malcolm, and also Fascinating Imperial Spaces, Placing the Irish and the Scots in Colonial Australia, published with Lindsay Proudfoot. She works on the Irish in Australia, Scots in Australia, but she's also got a focus on histories of violence, gender, religion, and memory. Her main new project at the moment, going back to earlier interests, is on the Irish in medieval and in early modern Ireland, and in the later Irish diaspora, around these themes of violence, gender, religion, and memory. She's the convener of the Melbourne Irish Studies Seminar, has been editor of the Australasian Journal of Irish Studies, and her earlier work on medieval Ireland was entitled Women in the Church in Medieval Ireland, 1140 to 1540. So it's fascinating to have somebody with such a range, and a range that is current, because I understand you are now working on the early modern period as well, which is fascinating. So your current project then is Gender, Violence in the Irish 1200 to the 20th century. And you have, of course, also published on that key issue of Irishness and race in Australia, also with Elizabeth. So it's a great pleasure for us to hear you here today on this slightly different variant on your focus, which is coming home. And so you're looking at Australians in Ireland from 1850 to 1925. So we're so pleased to have you. Thank you, Diane.
Great. Thanks very much. It's lovely to be here, and the weather, it's amazing. First of all, I'd like to thank Peter Gray for the invitation to speak here this evening, Margaret, of course, for your generous introduction, and Kathy Devlin, who was organising all the arrangements so efficiently. I'd just like to start by saying my research on the Irish in Australia actually started here in Queen's when I was in 2001, when I was appointed by the late Lindsay Proudfoot of the School of Geography to work on his Leverhulme funded project about the settlement patterns of the Irish and Scots, which resulted in that book that Margaret mentioned. And I really want to take this opportunity back here in Queen's to acknowledge his generosity, support and continued interest in my research on the Irish in Australia over the years since we first worked together. And I also want to acknowledge the work of one of my graduate students, Loretta Dinan, for her research on the Cook family of Limerick, some of whom are pictured here, who I'm going to start talking about, and I'll circle back to talk about them in a little while as well. So in 1854, after an uncomfortable voyage, marred by her 4 children's illnesses and only a few weeks in Melbourne, Mary Cook, who's pictured here at the right there, decided that migrating to the rough and ready gold rush town of Melbourne was a mistake. So she packed her newborn daughter and 3 older children back onto a ship, according to the family, the next available ship, leaving her husband Patrick and her sister Catherine to care for the sick toddler who was refused boarding, and returned to Limerick, where she and some of her children are pictured here in the family home. She remained there for over 3 years before returning to Australia with her children. Mary was not alone in travelling back and forth between Ireland and Australia, but her journeys are seldom noted in the general histories of migration and Australia. So thinking about return migration to Australia, I think the figure of the return Yank is perhaps reasonably well known. A migrant flush with funds from well-paying jobs in the United States who returned to their ancestral home and offended former neighbours by buying up too much property or marrying too well. Irish migrants returning from Australia, though, are less well known in popular culture, both here and here in Ireland and in Australia, than those returning from North America. But it doesn't mean that Irish men and women with Australian experience were absent from Irish communities. So what I want to do today is to explore that flow of people from Australia to Ireland during the 19th and early decades of the 20th century. Now, to do this, I'll first give a bit of an outline of the general flows of Irish migration to Australia, to give you a bit of a background for the much smaller numbers who returned. I then want to explore Irish return from Australia through 2 avenues: the Irish census data of 1901 and 1911, and then family archives and memories through the case study of the Cook family and their networks. Along the way, we'll meet Catholic women like Mary Cook, Protestant society women, working class families, widows, and prosperous businessmen, and children, all of whom left Australia to spend time in Ireland, some staying here permanently, others deciding after shorter and longer periods of time to go back to Australia. So, turning to migration to Australia. Now, much of the research on the Irish diaspora has concentrated, of course, on the large number of Irish who settled in North America from the 18th century onwards. There are differences, though, in the experience of Irish settlers in the Australian colonies and those in the United States and Canada. For a start, the numbers are very different. The number of Irish who settled in the Australian colonies in the 19th century was always far less than those who took the cheaper and shorter journey to either North America or England. About 400,000 Irish-born migrants settled in Australia between the first convict settlements in Sydney Cove in 1788 and about 1920. They settled there, built homes with nearly 1.6 million who arrived from England, Scotland and Wales. And collectively, this group dispossessed the original Indigenous inhabitants and set up settlements mostly around the east coast, but also in the south and the west of Australia as well. Initially, the white settlement was organised in 6 colonies, which then joined to form the Commonwealth of Australia in 1901. Irish people arrived in 3 very broad and overlapping ways: convicts and their guards between 1788 and 1868, when the convicts were stopped; free settlers who paid their own passage, mostly from the 1830s and including a huge influx in the 1850s at the time of the gold rushes. And finally, those who arrived from Ireland using one of the many government and private assisted passage schemes which operated between the early 1830s and 1922. Irish settlers in colonial Australia came from every county in Ireland, although some counties sent more than others. And David Fitzpatrick established some time ago that the counties of Clare, Tipperary and Limerick and adjacent sent the largest numbers of mostly Catholic migrants to the Australian colonies, with a secondary grouping of majority Protestants from the Ulster counties of Fermanagh, Cavan and Armagh. The impact of these migration flows, though, on the white population of Australia is much greater than the relatively low numbers suggest. By 1871, the proportion of Irish born in Australia was larger, as you can see, even though they're much smaller, smaller numbers than those in the other major diaspora destinations. And by 1901, Catholic Irish-born settlers and their descendants comprised just over a quarter of the white population. Estimating the number of Protestants migrating from Ireland to Australia is much harder to calculate for reasons I can go into if you like in the questions. But historians usually use the figure of about 20 or 25% of the Irish flow who arrived in Australia in the 19th century were Protestants. Unlike the Cook family, most of the Irish who arrived in the colonies from the 1830s onwards, both as assisted migrants and those who paid their own passage, tended to be young single adults. These young adults tended to follow chains of migration in that they were sponsored in some way, either financially or with other support, by family or friends who had preceded them. When they were established, they then in turn supported others from their networks at home to make the same journey. These young adults, men and women, often travelled with siblings, cousins or neighbours. And unlike migrants from the rest of Europe and Britain, Irish women migrated in roughly equal numbers to Irish men, and indeed in some years there were a majority of Irish women migrants. Now, the high costs and long journey times meant the Australian colonies were not a feasible destination for the very poor fleeing the devastation of the famine. The exception is a small number of young single women, about 4,000, from workhouses who were sponsored to travel directly to the Australian colonies in the early 1850s, and that's the memorial in Sydney to those women. Those who took up opportunities to travel through assisted migration schemes from the 1830s were not the poorest of the poor in Ireland. They needed to have some resources to negotiate complex immigration rules and systems and to manage the long voyage to Australia. And, as has recently been argued by Kean McMahon, the ships taking Irish migrants to colonial Australia were some of the most well-regulated and safest available at the time. These were not the coffin ships of popular imagination at all. Once they arrived in the Australian colonies, most Irish spread throughout the areas of white settlement rather than congregating in urban areas like so many did in North America. And although there were some clusters where Irish people from the same localities settled, this was less common than a sort of a much wider distribution. Australian colonial census data shows that there was very few areas that had any more than about 20% Irish born at any one time, and most areas had 10% Irish born or less. Yes, bare figures can disguise the Irish influence at different times. So, for example, in the 1860s, in the gold mining township of Stawell in colonial Victoria, all the ministers of religion were Irish born, as was the town clerk, the editor of the newspaper, and several of the most successful directors of mines, even though the population, the Irish-born population in that area was about 10% at the time. So in some areas, the Irish influence was actually quite high. Now, the Catholic Church was staffed almost exclusively by Irish clergy and religious personnel from the 1860s onwards, and they established churches, schools, hospitals, and welfare institutions which were imbibed with a strong sense of Irish culture and identity. Protestant migrants tended to blend much more into the general Protestant population, and apart from the network of Orange Lodges, tended not to be associated with Irish identity or Irish organisations in this period. Many Irish-born and their children, and the Catholics in particular, sustained a sense of Irish identity expressed through participation in Catholic lay societies, membership of Irish organisations, or contribution to Irish causes. We, of course, don't know the number of who didn't participate in any of this, who didn't feel a sense of needing to claim a sense of Irish identity. But those who wrote letters home to relatives in Ireland usually painted a rosy picture of life in the colonies, expressing their main regrets to be the loss of connection with family and friends rather than regret at leaving Ireland itself. The desire to see loved ones again, lost my place. The desire to see loved ones again, though, remained very strong. Some, of course, did suffer from discrimination and didn't end up doing as well as they had hoped. This is just a little snapshot of discrimination against women domestics in Australia through employment ads and also through cartoons in which you're probably very familiar with. They were around all over the English-speaking world. Discrimination against Irish servants. And St Patrick's Day, this is the very famous St Patrick's Day parade in 1920 in Melbourne, which drew enormous crowds because of the assassination of Archbishop Mannix. So there was a very strong sense of Irishness and Irish identity among many Catholic Irish, as you can see here. And the statue of Daniel O'Connell there, which is now situated in the gardens of St Patrick's Cathedral in Melbourne, was funded by raising money throughout Victoria. And there's long lists of people who contributed very small amounts to the raising of that statue, which has moved around a few times, but it's found a place in the cathedral grounds. So apart from the desire to see loved ones again, most Irish seem to be quite happy with their situation in Australia. However, return was usual enough to be mentioned by some letter writers as a common event. In 1860, for example, when William Fife in County Fermanagh wrote to his adult children in New South Wales, he noted that 2 of their acquaintance had returned from the colonies, reporting that work for educated men was hard to find. He possibly put that in to try and encourage his own children to come back, and they didn't. Some letter writers distinguish between shorter visits, possible to see family, and permanent return. As I said, for most, migration was a positive experience, and though they would like to see their loved ones, they didn't want to actually come home to Ireland. Biddy Burke wrote to her family initially of her desire to return to Galway when she first migrated to Brisbane in the 1880s, but by 1884 she wrote, "I might go and see the old sod once more, but I don't suppose I could ever live there now." So the concept of returning home for these immigrants encompassed both the possibility of permanent return, which was often not acted upon, most often not acted upon, and visiting to reconnect with family. Okay. I want to now turn to look at those small numbers, and we are talking small numbers, but I do think that they're important stories of those who did return to Ireland. One place to find them is the census records, and I'll turn now to the census returns of those of the 1901 and 1911 census. And I would also like very much to thank the digitalisation of these records, which makes it possible for me to do this research from Melbourne. And in looking at the census records, I want to focus on 3 groups that I found there: Protestant women, working class families, and Irish speakers. And then I'll move on to be looking at the archives of that one family. So, as many people here undoubtedly know, the Irish census of 1901 and 1911 did not collect data on previous residents or time spent outside of Ireland. So this data can't assist us in finding people who had returned after spending any amount of time away from Ireland. However, there is one approximate measure of returning migrants, and that is the Australian-born present in the census records. Now, using this as a measure of return migration assumes or suggests, invites questions of whether the approximately 1,000 Australian-born present in Ireland on each of the 2 censuses were the children or grandchildren of migrants who returned with their parents. So, as an example of how this can work, how we can find returned Irish migrants through their children, is this census record here of the Cathcart family from County Antrim. In this census, the Robert and Margaret Cathcart are recorded living with their adult children, 20-year-old Annie, who was also born in County Antrim. However, the 3 younger children, aged between 18 and 15, had been born in Australia. The records of their place of birth in the census makes it clear that Robert and Margaret migrated to Australia with a very young child, Annie, and then had 3 more children before returning to the farm. Further investigations in the Australian vital registration data shows that the family lived in or near the small Victorian rural village of Woodford, as this is where all 3 children's births were registered. And it's the presence of the Australian-born children that indicate this family had left Ireland, gone to Australia and then returned. It is, however, only an approximate measure because unless people were living with children who had been born in Australia, you don't find them using this measure. However, it's worth investigating further. So just quickly to go through some of the things that I found. This is a graph representation of the numbers we're looking at. As I said, about 1,000 in total, not in each census, so not a lot. And the majority of them living in Dublin and then in Belfast. So going down into the different, most living in the, most of them are in the counties that sent out the most to Ireland, so Limerick and Tipperary are well represented, for example. If you look at some more graphs of the breakdown, we see that in both years there's more females than males. And if we look at the Protestants and Catholics, we see that there are more Protestant females, more than we would expect. You can see there that there's 32-ish% Protestant females. And looking at that another way, this is the Catholic Australian-born showing what you'd expect really if you're looking at a population of children. You'd expect a fairly even gender distribution. And this is what we get when we see the Protestant women. So there's obviously far more Protestant females in Ireland have been born in Australia than you would expect. And there's more Protestants there than we would expect if we were expecting only people Australian-born who were the children or grandchildren of migrants, because there were far fewer Protestants who went to Australia in the first place. So what I did then was to look at that in a bit more detail, and I chose looking at the returns for County Dublin. So I looked at the 68 Australian-born Protestant females in the 1911 census. Again, they're very small numbers, but these are indicative of different migration flows. There were 3 distinct groups of Protestant Australian females that I found. The first were those, and about 40%, who were living with Irish-born relatives, parents, grandparents, aunts, cousins, indicating they were certainly of Irish parentage or descent. A second group were living with Irish-born husbands, and then a third group, which was about 30% of them, had no obvious Irish connection. Many were married to men who weren't Irish-born. Even if we estimate that half of this 20% of Australian-born Protestant women had Irish parents or grandparents themselves, that leaves about 50% of Australian-born Protestant females who were not returning to Ireland. They were living there in Dublin, but they weren't returning in any sense within their family. And looking more closely at both their and their husbands' occupations, these are obviously part of what we might call the imperial workforce. For example, we have women such as Catherine Mortimer, who was an Australian-born nurse working in the household of Sir William Lee Plunkett. She likely had no Irish family background and had probably joined the household when Sir William was Governor-General of New Zealand to assist with the care of his very young children. Other women were wives of men who were working in various industries in Dublin. Kate Augusta Henning, for example, was living with her English-born husband and 2 children in a large house in Rathmines in 1911. There's no obvious family connections, and the family presumably were living there because of his occupation as a brewer. These women could just as easily have been living in London, Bristol or Johannesburg, and were part of the transnational networks of work and travel, either on their own or with their families. Others were visiting Ireland. And if we look at the Australian-born people who were recorded as being visitors, which was a category in the census, there's very small numbers, but there's about 3% of the total Australian-born in both censuses, and most of those were Protestant females. These women and girls were usually staying in hotels or with people to whom they were not related, suggesting that these Protestant women and their daughters were travelling for leisure. Overall, these visitor numbers in the census are certainly an underestimation, as the return form asks for each person's relationship with the head of household. So it's most likely that the head of household said that the person visiting was a niece or a granddaughter rather than a visitor, because that's actually what the question said. So, for example, Vance McCartney was listed as the niece of William Watson in 1911, and she was actually the granddaughter of the Dublin-born Anglican Dean of Melbourne, the very Reverend Dr. H.B. McCartney, and we know she was back in Queensland by 1911. It's probable that she and others like her were on extended visits or perhaps trial settlement, perhaps as strategies for themselves or for their families for them to gain international education and experiences, possibly to look for husbands from the elite Irish Australian Protestant families. It's clear from the higher numbers of prosperous Protestant females classified as visitors or as they appear to be visitors within households that Dublin was one of the European destinations that elite Australian-born females favoured for leisure travel, family visits or education. Many fellow Australian women did travel quite extensively at this time. There's been recent research on Australian women in London showing that there were far more of them travelling for work, study or leisure than has previously been supposed. The final group of Australian Protestant women and girls in the Dublin census were indeed returning to the island with their parents or grandparents to live. For example, Sydney-born Jane Rutherford, who was 14 and living with her unmarried Dublin-born aunt in 1901 and still living with her in 1911. They were living in a very substantial house in Killiney. And Jane's own family in Sydney perhaps could no longer care for her. Perhaps she'd been orphaned, or she may have been sent as a companion to her wealthy aunt. But anyway, she was certainly living there for an extended period of time. Another group were widows with children who returned presumably permanently to access family support after bereavement. Dublin-born Harriet Smith, for example, had married English surgeon Alfred Douglas in Sydney in 1889. They settled in a small regional town called Cootamundra in New South Wales and had 3 small daughters before he was killed in an accident in 1894. She returned and was living in Dublin in 1901 with her 6-year-old daughter, and her older twin daughters were at boarding school in England. She stayed in Ireland and was living in a comfortable house in Skerries in 1911 with 2 of her daughters, while one of them had remained in England. From these very few facts, one can conjure up an image that she had returned to gain comfort, support and help in raising her children from either her own and her husband's family in Ireland and England. So, turning now to Catholic Australian-borns who we find, they're far less likely to be living in very substantial housing. They're far less likely to be visiting. They're mostly living within family units. Most of them are not as prosperous as the ones that we've just been talking about, although there are exceptions. Catholics such as Margaret Ryan, South Australian-born daughter of a Tipperary family who had done very well. She had met Englishman Walter Strickland when he was visiting Adelaide, and they'd married in Dublin in 1874. He went on to become director of the National Gallery of Ireland in Dublin, which gave the couple entry into Dublin's elite social circle. And of course, it is well known, when Irish politicians Willie and John Redmond were travelling in Australia in 1883, they were hosted for some of their visits by Limerick-born James Dalton, who had done very well indeed, and was living in Orange in rural New South Wales. Later on that year, Joanna Dalton, James's Australian-born sister, married John Redmond, while Eleanor, James's daughter, married Willie a couple of years later. Both women then left Australia, although Eleanor and Willie did make several visits back home, back to Australia. Okay, just turning now to some of the poorer people we find, and this was more unexpected. That voyage back from Australia to Ireland was expensive and it was long. And so to find people who were living in very poor housing in Dublin was a little bit less expected. The cost and the time of that journey from Australia to Ireland had declined, of course, with the introduction of steam travel. However, the passage for a family was still very expensive. We just don't know who funded the return journeys of children, such as 9-year-old Thomas Atkinson, living in 1901 with his Dublin-born grandparents and an aunt in 3 rooms in central Dublin, for example. The Nolan family is another one, I think here, who were living in a 2-room second-class house in Newcastle, County Limerick in 1901. Mary had been born in Australia and married Limerick-born Thomas Nolan in Sydney in 1890, and their daughter Annie was born the next year. And this is another one where you can trace the family's return by the birth of children, because the younger 4 children were all born in County Limerick. He's listed here as an agricultural labourer. So this family, although clearly not showing signs of wealth, seem to have had enough networks to enable them to return to Limerick. Okay. So another family who seem to have had some assistance, or certainly the resources in able to return, were the Broderick family. And I'll just talk about them a little bit. In 1901, they were living in one of the recently built Ivy Trust dwellings in New Bride Street in Dublin, which were built mostly for employees of Guinness. Galway-born John and Mary Broderick had migrated as a young married couple to Brisbane in 1888, as on one of those assisted migration schemes that I spoke about. They had had 2 children while in Queensland in 1889 and 1891 respectively. They were able to either sell assets, perhaps, although the 1890s weren't a good time to sell assets in Australia, which was undergoing a sharp financial and economic decline at the time. Or they were able to draw on Irish family resources to fund their return, as they were in Dublin by 1896 when the next child was born. John is listed as a labourer in a bond warehouse, so presumably Guinness's, in the 1901 census. The Queensland-born son Joseph is absent in 1901 and is possibly the Joseph Broderick visiting the household of 2 priests in Galway, because there's an Eleanor Broderick who's the housekeeper at the time. So maybe this is a family network. In 1911, the family are doing well. They're living at the same address. Queensland-born Joseph is now studying at university, and the father and the daughter, Queensland-born daughter, are working in warehouses for wine and spirits, presumably Guinness's. John and Mary spent less than 8 years in Queensland before returning to Dublin rather than their native Galway. Their ability to travel back suggests the family had maintained contact with their Irish networks while in Queensland and could call on the considerable resources to fund a family of 4 to return at that time. So they're the families some of the families that you can find that are found in the census. There's another group that I found fascinating. They're very small, but they're really quite interesting, I think. And they're the ones who are listed as Irish speaking. So in the 1911 census, when there's a question about Irish speaking, 44 Australian-born residents of Ireland ticked that box, said that they could speak Irish. All except 1 was Catholic. Now, these numbers are tiny, of course, so all we can say is be a bit suggestive, but they're suggestive of a usually hidden aspect of Irish settlement in Australia. There are only tantalisingly scant traces of migrants speaking Irish once they had settled in the Australian colonies. This is despite the fact, as suggested by Val Noon and Dim Flanagan, that probably as many as half of the migrants who arrived in Australia could speak Irish on arrival. However, the Australian colonies, of course, were solely English-speaking, so Irish-speaking settlers needed to conduct at least their public lives in English. We can probably assume that many Australian-born children of Irish speakers understood some Irish if their parents were speaking it, and there's tiny, tiny hints of that. For example, the Cook family, who we saw at the beginning and who I'll talk about again, 2 of the adult sons got into a fight on the veranda of the hotel where they were, and they ended up in court, which is how we know about this. And it was said in the court testimonies that they had been swearing at each other in Irish and swearing at everybody else in Irish. Now, one of those 2 was one of those children we saw in the photograph who had gone back to Ireland and then came back again, and he had gone to school for a couple of years in Limerick apparently, but the other had been born in Australia. Certainly no statistics were ever collected on the number of Irish speakers in Australia, so there is very little evidence on the level of Irish speaking within families. So if we look at those 44 Australian-born residents, I think I've divided them into two main groups. The first are those who were born in Australia who probably learned Irish after they arrived back here. And that includes Matthew Kennedy, for example, who on the death of his parents in Victoria was sent with his younger sister to live with grandparents in Tipperary, which is where they are in 1901. In 1911, he's likely to be the Matthew Kennedy living independently in Dublin and speaking both Irish and English. And we know that he later spent time in the United States and then resettled in Australia, becoming very prominent in Irish circles as a fluent Irish speaker and singer in Irish nationalist groups. Another group of Irish speakers are those Australian-born children who were living in families where everyone listed as speaking Irish, indicating that they probably were speaking Irish within the family unit when they were in Australia. The Broderick family were actually one of those. They all said that they spoke Irish in the 1911 census. And another was Sarah and Sabina Lavelle, who had been born in Melbourne in the late 1870s, and their siblings were born in Mayo in 1880s, indicating the date of the family's return. All the family are listed as speaking Irish in 1911, so we can surmise that they continued to speak Irish while they were living in Australia. These families and some others provide tantalising evidence that there were parents speaking Irish to children in the home setting in Australia. And it may also be evidence that, as an indicator that they always intended to return, and speaking Irish was a way of ensuring their children were equipped to converse with relatives, perhaps when they returned. Okay. Now, the census data can only give us so much, fascinating and all as it is. And they can never show us the many Irish and Irish Australians who returned outside of census years or who are not living with their Australian-born children. So family archives, letters, photographs, newspaper clippings, as well as stories handed down through generations can give rich detail about those who left Australia permanently or temporarily. Oops. I missed one. So now I want to return to the Cook family of Limerick as a case study of migration, return and final settlement to Australia. Oh, sorry, that's Nicholas O'Donnell, who is a prominent Irish speaker in Melbourne. He never came to Ireland. He was born in Australia to presumably Irish-speaking parents, and he learned Irish and corresponded with Douglas Hyde and others, became very important as an Irish speaker. Now, the research, as I said, on the Cook family is that of one of my graduate students, Loretta Diamond. So let's return to Mary Walsh. Here she is back in Limerick with her children, and she had apparently according to the family stories, she had arrived in Melbourne, had been horrified by the rough and ready accommodation that was available, and here's a painting of what it probably was like, Canvas Town, just tents, because so many people had converged on Melbourne during the gold rush years, and she wasn't having any of it. The voyage, as I said, had been marred by illness among the children, her own advanced pregnancy, and the youngest one was actually seriously ill with measles when they disembarked. She was appalled by what she saw, and family stories suggest that she was also appalled by what she perceived to be the treacherous, and they're the words the family used, Indigenous people that she saw were around them, threatening her family. The family also recalls she promised Patrick she would return once he had built her a new home. He did indeed establish himself as a successful farmer in Pyalong, an area north of Melbourne, and after 3.5 years, Mary and the children made the voyage again and joined him in farming and opening a successful hotel. It's now unknown in the family, though, if another part of that promise was that if he didn't do it, if he didn't establish the successful home, that he would go back to Ireland. When I mentioned that to Loretta, she thought, oh, I don't know about that, but it's possible. Patrick also returned. He returned 30 years later in the 1880s. And it seems that it was only in retirement, when he could leave the farm to his adult sons, that he could turn thoughts to the land he had sold over 30 years earlier. Although some of the details within the family are unclear, we know he spent 18 months back in Limerick, partly visiting family, but also launching unsuccessful legal action to try and recover the land he had sold prior to emigration. He may have been trying to establish a home for himself and his wife to retire to. Whatever the reasons, his negotiations were not successful, and he returned to the family farm and hotel in Pylon for the remainder of his life. His actions indeed have echoes of that returned Yank stereotype that I mentioned earlier, returning with money and attempting to secure property. Like the stereotypical returned Yank, Patrick's actions were not welcomed by his Limerick relatives, according to the stories passed down within the family. They didn't like it, and so he sort of had no choice but to go back. Men like Patrick Cook returned to Ireland in retirement more often than women did at a similar life stage. And among the group of Irish families who were their friends and relatives in Pylon, at least 3 men returned to Ireland for visits, unaccompanied by their Irish-born wives. It's likely single women were more able to travel than those with responsibilities of their own families. And we also have another member of the extended Cook family, Kit Fogarty, who after 30 years in Australia travelled on her own back to family in Limerick for 9 months and wrote a diary and connected with family and places that she had left. Letters, she had obviously kept in touch with her family in Limerick over the years, and letters fueled the desire of many, such as the Cook family, to make return a possibility, even if only some of them took it up. So, in conclusion, migration was not always a one-way process. Although only small numbers made the long voyage back from Australia, the possibility of return was likely to have remained for many. Newspaper reports at the time privileged narratives of successful men, like Thomas Kinsler, returning for one last visit after retirement to see ageing relatives. Thomas Kinsler here was feted by his community in Stawell with a formal dinner and presentation prior to travelling to see his mother in Wexford in 1890. And there's many, many, many stories like this of men who have big dinners that show that they've made a success in Australia. They go back to Ireland to see usually their ageing mother, and then they come back. And that sort of stereotype has given rise to most historians thinking that they were the ones who went back, successful businessmen, successful farmers who might go back. Investigating family stories and crucially also the census shows it was much more complicated than that. Far wider range of people returned, including many, many women and children did make the journey back, some permanently, others for a short or a longer time that was not permanent. But that possibility of return was something that underlined, I would suggest, the probably unfulfilled dreams for many, that they knew they could go back because they knew of people who did, even if they themselves were reasonably happy to stay with their new lives in their new home. And I'll leave it there.
Thanks so much, Diana. You're willing to take questions?
Yeah, absolutely.
Fantastic. I'll leave you there. I'll speak on that.
Do you want the...
Well, I don't know if we need a microphone,
yeah, okay.
really. Go around. So yeah, I think go ahead. I'll bring the mic down. I don't think we need it. The acoustics here are fine, aren't they? So yeah, thank you so much. I'm taking questions. Peter McLaughlin.
Sorry, I'm right back up the retreat.
Hi. Come up a bit.
So hopefully you can hear me. Can I say a bit about, you said a lot there about kind of real cultural nationalism, Catholicism, religion, but about the politics. Presumably there are parallels with Irish and American, of course, what's going on, home rule and so on, or was there a positive difference in the distance?
Look, there were differences. Yeah, there certainly were differences. One of the biggest ones was that Australia was part of the British Empire. So there was anybody who spoke up against sort of for what we might call more extreme republicanism was pushed down really hard and actually was often accused of treason.
Probably more like Canada.
Yeah, much more like Canada. Yeah, so there was support for home rule. There was big support for home rule within Irish organisations. Many Irish Australians saw home rule as being giving to their relatives in Ireland what they had in Australia, which was self-government within a context of the British Empire, and they felt they had done very well, and so that's what they wanted. They saw home rule as something that would give their relatives back home what they had. So they were very supportive of home rule, and the Redmond Brothers tour in 1883 raised huge amounts of money and was very successful. And there were other politicians came and raised money as well for home rule. Yeah. So absolutely, yes, yeah, absolutely. There was a couple of sort of Fenian scares in the 1868 was one, and a little bit later. They were almost certainly based on very little. Yeah, there was very little. People often cite some of the earlier convict rebellions. And sort of in the early 1800s, and there is some possibility of that, but most of the 1798, for example, convicts who went there settled down quite quickly and became absolute model citizens. Yeah, so yeah, they didn't continue. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks very much for the lecture. One of the sort of consistent characteristics of transatlantic migrants from Ireland was the low rate of return. And that obviously can only be judged when you set it against the other ethnicity. So I suppose my predictable question is, what, if anything, do we know about the comparative picture in return from Australia to, for example, Scotland, Wales, England, not to mention France, Germany, Greece, etc.?
Yeah, absolutely. There's been research done on the census data for England and Wales in a similar-ish way than what I've done here. There's estimates, and it can only be estimates because the shipping return data isn't very good, that approximately 20% returned to England and Wales of migrants who went. Now, these numbers are nothing like that. So we are looking at a much smaller rate of return, I would say, to Ireland. However, we can't, and the same with the data from England, you can't get at anything apart from the census data. The shipping data to England, and most of the ships went to England, and then people would travel across to Ireland. So we can't really disentangle that either. You can't really disentangle people who are travelling for business, politics, going to diplomats, all those sort of people, with people who are going to visit family, for education. Lots and lots of Australian English families who had the money would send their children, particularly boys, to be educated in England. You can't sort of disentangle that very well from those who were returning permanently. Certainly, the rate of return among the Irish is less than that going back to England. The numbers from other countries are very small in the Australian colonies up to about 1920. So the numbers are so small, you can't really make, you can't make proper comparisons really. You can't do the sort of comparison that you can do from North America, where large numbers of Italians went back, for example. Italian migration doesn't really kick up to Australia until after the Second World War, and then it's massive, but it wasn't that much. There was some, but not much before then.
Sean?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, the numbers are very small, but what makes that really striking is that the Irish in Australia are very mobile group.
Yes.
Because quite a big chunk of the Irish population in California,
yes,
in the 1850s, for example, have come to Australia.
Mm.
And quite a big chunk of the Irish population in New Zealand have come from Australia. So it's not just that, the long voyage, Ireland and so on. You're actually looking at people who don't seem to have particularly roots in Australia, who are prepared to go somewhere else if they see an opportunity. But Ireland is not one of those places.
Yes, and that's particularly, as you say, the gold rush period, and they're chasing gold. So those who are chasing gold and other opportunities, they do tend to travel. And yes, lots, and travelling within Australia as well. So the initial gold rushes are in Victoria, then they rush up to New South Wales, and there's rushes up to Queensland, and later in the 19th century across to Western Australia. And huge numbers move all around following the gold, yeah.
But that makes religions to actually, or their lack of interest in the actual island all the more striking, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. They obviously had enough of a travel sort of bug to be able to contemplate the voyage, but they don't go back. Yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I was wondering how many of these people are found in institutions like schools on the census, because obviously earlier in the 19th century you've got people back Ireland to take part in the Victorian one and also in schools. So are these kind of coming back to family groups, or do you have like quite a few in some big boarding schools?
There's certainly, I didn't talk about them. There's several groups that I could have talked about, and schools were one of them. Yes, they're in school. There are in schools, not large numbers, but you can find them. Some of them I've been able to trace that they were with a family group in 1901 and then in school in 1911. So you can sort of see that they're established in Ireland. They're going to school as any other family members would. There are reports though of, and there's certainly some family stories of people being sent to school in Ireland. Again, the numbers aren't big, but they're there. You definitely get seminarians. You definitely get men sent back or going back to go to seminaries in Ireland, and you also get a reasonable group of priests who retire to Ireland. Yeah, there's lots of those in the newspapers too. That, you know, Father so and so has long and productive life in Australia is now going back, or they go back for their health. I'm not sure why, but anyway, they go back for their health. Yeah.
There's a few nuns that go back as well.
That's right. Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
Sorry, man over here beside Eamon. Yeah.
I was interested in the imperial dimensions of this migration. And we know, I'm thinking of comparisons with other colonies which were not settled colonies. So we know, for instance, that the Irish were very overrepresented in India. At the time of the Indian Mutiny of 1857, there were apparently about half the East India Company army was of Irish origin. So I'm wondering if there are sort of comparisons here between the settler colonies like Australia and other locations. Now, many of the Irish going out to India would presumably expect much more strongly to come back, but many didn't, and many stayed on, married, and so on and so forth. So I was wondering whether you have any thoughts on this kind of comparison.
I think it's a really interesting comparison because, as you say, it is a very different settlement colonial experience between Australia and India. Certainly, you do get similar numbers in the British Army who come to Australia are Irish, as the ones who were in the various armies in India, and quite a number actually go from India to Australia as well. That they spend time in India and then they come to Australia. And there's actually some of the they're definitely the poorer sibling groups in the census. One sibling is born in Australia and one is born in India, and they're in their 60s and 70s, which indicates that they're children of army people who have then gone back to Ireland. I haven't done a precise comparison. I think that would be a really interesting thing to do between the settlement and return from Australia and that from places like India. I think that would be really interesting, yeah, because there's some similarities, as you say, but there are also differences, yeah. I think there's people at the back.
Sorry, I can't. Somebody at the back, is there?
Did they assimilate into Australia? Did they become Australian, or did they hold strongly to the Irish identity? What would be the view of that? It's multi-layered, I think. I think for some people, they definitely held, and still do, hold on to a sense of being Irish. They sing Irish songs at Christmas. They know that they've got cousins or, you know, relatives in Australia, and that is an important part of their identity and continues to be. So it's been generations. Others, it's much less so. And
But there's also a sense for many Australians who are in that, you know, singing Irish songs at Christmas group, that they can hold multiple identities as well at the same time. Like they're quite proud and, you know, foremost Australians, but they know where they've come from, Ireland. The vast majority though of white settler Australian would have many different strands, would be Irish, German, English, Scottish in their family history. Some families choose to prioritise memories and celebrating their Irishness, others don't. And it's an interesting thing, and it would be a very interesting study to do, particularly people now, but there's not a lot of data on that. Certainly the first couple of generations, some keep quite a strong sense of Irishness, particularly within the church, and those who are educated in Catholic church schools kept a sense of Irishness because they learned about Ireland. Those outside of that orbit, less so.
Sorry, there was somebody there trying to ask a question who this man here, yeah.
I'm interested in travel and transport in the 19th century. And you mentioned that it was much safer to go to Australia than to go west, and so on. I just wondered, is there much in the literature about the actual voyage, the journey, as opposed to what happened before that?
Yeah, look, that's a really interesting thing, the voyage. There is quite a nice collection of diaries, for example, of, they're usually people who are middle-class people who write diaries about their voyage, and some of them are really interesting and they talk about the wider passengers and what happens. Others are a little bit narrower and just talk about they don't like the food. But we certainly do have diaries of that voyage. We've got, they kept quite reasonably good records, particularly of the assisted migration ones. They're good records. You can actually trace people, that they document them when they arrive. They're signed off by the doctor and they're signed off by the matron, and they're kept a pretty close eye on. They've all got matrons. Most of them have doctors on board. They're trying to get them here in good health after having some that didn't. Obviously, disasters happened, and there are some particular ships that had outbreaks of disease or shipwrecked or things happened. But overall, they were quite safe, those ones coming out. And Ken McMahon, who's got a recent book on shipping both west and includes analysis of Australia, concludes that the voyages to Australia were very well regulated, partly because they were so long and they really did have to look after people in order to make sure that they arrived safely. Yeah.
Way.
Hello, thank you very much. I really enjoyed seeing the glimpses of some of the narratives. So I mean, maybe the question about the answer just isn't the sources there for, but I'm wondering about the returning Irish. Are there elements that they brought back with them? So what about Australian culture or songs coming back, food, cookery, you know?
Oh, wouldn't it be wonderful to find some of that? Yeah. I know that I don't have a lot of detail on that, and that would be really interesting. I know that artifacts came back. So like some of the things in the museum, for example, are from people who went to Australia. I know that Kathleen Barry, who was one of the activists in the revolutionary period, she did a speaking tour of Australia, of the eastern coast of Australia in the 1920s, and she was given an emu egg with carving on it, which was quite a popular thing to be given. And she describes it in her letters back to her husband that she's been given this emu egg and she's taken it back. So presumably yes, but at the moment I've only got glimpses of that, but it would be a fascinating thing to find out about whether people did bring things back with them. Yeah.
Peter.
Thanks, Diane. I mean, as you know, I've been interested in probably one of the most famous of the returned Irish from Australia, to Charles Gavin Duffy. Of course, he returned not to Ireland, but to the south.
That's right, yes.
With a very substantial pension from the Victorian government in 1880 after 25 years in Australia.
Yeah.
But with side trips, obviously, to Ireland to pursue his interests. I'm wondering, thinking about him as an Irishman returning somewhere else, and particularly thinking about, the imperial workforce that you talked about, it's a significant number of better off Protestant returnees, but there's also likely to be a significant proportion of Irish-born returnees in GB
Oh, yeah.
as opposed to Ireland, particularly in those categories?
Absolutely, and he's not the only one who returned. The Wilson family also, members of the Wilson family also returned, who were very, very substantial landowners in Victoria, and there were 5 brothers, I think, and they 3 or 4 of them and their wives did come back. They're all from, I think they're from Antrim. They're all from Antrim, and there's some nice research being done on the letters that the family wrote to each other. When they went back, 2 of the women went back to Antrim, but the rest of them all went back to England, or went to England. Yes, they didn't go to. And Samuel Wilson was the wealthiest of them all, and he went back to England and bought a nice substantial part there and retired nicely. Yes, yeah. So certainly there's a sense that for families like that, there's a sense that the empire was the space where they could move around, and they don't seem to have had strong roots strong enough roots in Ireland to want to go back there when they had made their fortunes in Australia. That wasn't what they seemed to be wanting to do. The women who went back had small children, so presumably they got back for family support.
Diane.
Thanks, Diane. I'm just wondering about attitudes towards women who came back from Australia seeking a husband, because we know the American bride, so-called, was not always welcome with a different accent, style of dress, and really for subverting that system of arranged marriages that prevailed for so long. So do we know anything about these women?
Not really, and I'd love to know more about that. There's hints of people who go back to find, but it's usually to find a wife, not to find a husband. And I haven't come across any in particular who've gone back to find wealthy to find a husband, but I'm looking for them. Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Well, I think perhaps we have worked too hard on that. Shall I go? Does somebody else want to ask a question? At least you have an opportunity to speak to Diane over drinks and over tea. So if your further questions do occur to you, you can speak to her more informally. Just like to say thank you so much, Diane. Thanks for a wonderful lecture.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.